I'm Chelsea from the Truro Council on Aging, and today with us we have Larry Dapsis. He's an entomologist with Cape Cod Cooperative Extension. Hi Larry, how are you?
I'm very good, Chelsea. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us again, and tell us about what we're going to be discussing today.
Today we are going to look at the world of insect evolution. And I think we're going to look at some examples of insect diversity and the fact that they've been on the planet for so long.
Yes.
that they have adapted to in ways that are it's almost unimaginable. So what I'm going to do right now is share my screen.
Awesome.
And we shall begin.
All right, I'll leave it to you. Thanks, Larry.
Okay. Coming up, go into slideshow. Very good, and we're off. And this is actually one of the reasons I became an entomologist. I mean, I knew since age 5 I was going to be a scientist. I just wasn't sure exactly what kind. But I've been fascinated with the world of insects and other life forms for many, many, many years. If we look at insects as a group, they basically dominate the planet in terms of number of species. I mean, they are found everywhere. And if you look at, insects compared to mammals, for example, we have about, 5,500 species of mammals, 10,000 species of birds, about another 10,000 for reptiles, as well as amphibian, 30,000 for fishes. And if you look at insects, we have 1 million described species. And I will tell you firsthand that million, that's a wrong number, okay? It's because the bug people, we're still counting. In fact, new species of insects are being discovered all the time. One of my good friends in graduate school at UMass Amherst, David Amsky, he now works for the Smithsonian. And I ran into Dave at a professional meeting and we're comparing notes on what we were doing job-wise. And he was telling me that they were sending groups of people down into the South American rainforest. And his specialty is Microlepidoptera, little tiny moths. And he told me in their surveillance that in their collections, 9 out of 10 specimens were not described. And that's 9 out of 10 every single night. So if you do the math and extrapolate, it suggests that 1 million number could easily be 5 million. There are entomologists that project further that there could be 10 million species of insects. So they basically are the dominant form of life on this planet. All right, if you look at insect evolution as a family tree, it starts out at the bottom, like the trunk of the tree. These are orders. So basically general buckets that we put different groups of insects into before we get into further, smaller buckets like, genus and species. So you look at the primitive insects, like the bristles and the fire brats down at the bottom. And then they branch out, the first insects that had wings, and then wings that could be folded along their back and let them to get into smaller places to exploit, new environments. The development of social insects and chemical communication and other ways. So they basically have branched out into a variety of different players. If we look at beetles in particular, they are the most diverse insect order of all. In fact, there's 400,000 species of beetles, and so beetles alone, if you were to cover your eyes and try and guess what type of animal you were, the chances are 1 in 4 that you're some type of beetle. They're that numerous. All right, if we look at basic principles of evolution, we have to think about populations in terms of a gene pool. So genes are those things in our DNA that convey, and they build certain proteins that might make things, that make us all up. And so the important thing about a gene pool is that genes are variable. They're not uniform through a population, so there's all kinds of variation. If we think of this in terms of people, you have a room full of people and look around, not everybody's hair type is exactly the same color or the same texture. And that's because you have these genes that vary in subtle different ways. And these characteristics can be selected for if there's enough pressure on that, which we'll talk about right now. So the principle that drives evolution is natural selection. It used to be called survival of the fittest, but it's really it's about gene pool. So if you look at this simplified diagram, we've got a lizard here and a group of leaf beetles on a leaf. And so basically those beetles that had coloration that more closely matched the color of the leaf were less likely to be detected by this predator. But those that stood out a little bit more, they were not so green, maybe greenish brown. And those were selected out and easily seen by the predators. So what happens is that over generations, over long periods of time, these subtle changes in the gene pool result in certain characteristics being fixed within that population. And it isn't static because selection pressures, as we will see in a real striking example, can flip and the population characteristics change actually quite quickly. So let's look at our first example. Um, this is a monarch butterfly caterpillar and it's feeding on milkweed. And milkweed contains certain chemicals that are toxic, called cardiac glycosides. And these caterpillars actually sequester those chemicals, and those cardiac glycosides get carried over into the adult stage of the monarch. And so basically, that makes this creature toxic to predators. So if you have a juvenile blue jay, for example, that has never seen a monarch butterfly before and happens to choose to eat that blue jay within 10 or so minutes is going to get violently sick and throw up. And the bird's now thinking, really, what the heck did I eat that made me so violently sick? Oh yeah, that orange and black butterfly. Never going to do that again. So birds very quickly learn that this is not something that's basically prey for them. So we have, things in evolutionary biology that sometimes it's really an advantage to look like something that's either noxious or dangerous. And so we have the viceroy butterfly. The viceroy butterfly with, I mean, very striking. It almost looks like identical to the monarch butterfly. There's some subtle characteristics, but it looks close enough to come off as a monarch butterfly. Well, the viceroy butterfly, the caterpillars feed on completely different plant matters. The viceroy butterfly is not toxic. They're quite palatable. They'd be easy prey for something. But the birds that have had an experience with the monarch butterflies are going to avoid the viceroy butterfly at all costs. And so the way, if you think about how this probably occurred through the process of natural selection, starting from the upper left to the lower right, with each succeeding generation, those butterflies in a population that had a higher proportion of orange on its wings versus black, that would be selected for in a small way and be carried to successive generations. And through that process of natural selection over time, you end up with something like a viceroy butterfly that looks like a pretty good knockoff for what a real monarch is. But we're talking about millions of years for these processes to occur. All right, let's look at an example in the UK. This is a peppered moth. Not easy to see, but here it is right here in the middle of the frame. And peppered moths, they're found in the United Kingdom. And as you can see here, they blend in perfectly on these white birch trees. So it's a very good way that it's evolved to avoid predators. Well, with this gene pool variability, um, there is a certain fraction of peppered moths that actually have a very dark wing structure makeup, okay, a dark morph, as we say. And so they're easily seen on the side of trees, but there's not enough predators to fully take out that particular set of genes. So you're always going to have a certain fraction of that population that have that dark variation. Well, during the Industrial Revolution, when we were building factories and burning dirty fuels, fossil fuels like coal, that resulted in a lot of soot, a lot of pollution that filtered into the countryside. So those beautiful white birch trees all of a sudden had a very dark appearance. Now the advantage is flipped. Those peppered moths that had the very dark coloration in their wings were a lot less likely to be seen as prey by lizards and birds, but that very light colored morph, now that stood out like the sore thumb. So this kind of reversed the whole thing. And as we cleaned up the environment and those white birch trees reverted back to their nice light colored bark, again, there was a flip in the moth population where now the predominant form are the light colored wing morphs. All right. A lot of insects have adapted to look like things that might not be palatable to a predator. So this is a group of mantids that have evolved over time to look largely like foliage, where they're in a canopy that they've selected, and through natural selection, that's their environment. And it's pretty difficult to pick them out from the background environment. And we see other groups of insects that mimic other types of plant parts. This is really shown nicely in tree hopper evolution. There's a number of different tree hoppers. They look like thorns. So they basically look like something that would be pretty unpalatable. I mean, who's going to want to mess around with thorns on a plant? So it kind of makes them safe. And tree hoppers, they are in a group of insects that have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So basically, they feed on plant sap, and in order to derive enough nutrients from that uh, low nutrient content plant sap, um, they ingest lots of plant sap, and as a result, they basically poop out sugar, and that is very attractive. Oh, let me go forward just one bit. Yeah, you can have groups of these things of tree hoppers, and yeah, who would take that for being something other than a thorny branch? But getting back to this honeydew, this tree hopper poop, yeah, very attractive to ants. And ants, once they learn about this source of sugar, they basically are defending those plant hoppers. So not only do the plant hoppers look kind of like part of the plant architecture, but they also now have an additional layer of protection in the ants. Well, as evolutionary processes moved on, there were groups of plant hoppers that further were selected and evolved to look like the ants themselves. These aren't ants; these are plant hoppers that actually look like the ants that are protecting them. So they don't even need the real ants. They basically have evolved to a point where they've cut out the middleman. It does look to an advantage that something like a yellow jacket. Yeah, these girls, they have an attitude, they're very aggressive at times, and they will protect themselves. And so there's a lot of potential predators that just steer clear of these things. Well, there's selection pressure on other groups of insects that don't have the capacity to sting, but they kind of take on the form of a yellow jacket. Right here, this is a syrphid fly. So they don't sting, they're completely harmless. They're actually hoverflies, they're very good beneficial. Their larvae move around the surface of leaves, feeding on soft-bodied insects like aphids. But as an adult stage, looking like a yellow jacket, yeah, a lot of things just gonna let them stand clear. And we see this in the hoverfly populations. Many different species have evolved this strategy. Yeah, we're going to look like something that can sting you. All right, here's some other really good examples of moths that through natural selection have evolved to fool potential predators or herbivores. Um, yeah, this is a moth, and like the hoverflies, it's evolved to look, like a wasp. And so basically that is a nice layer of protection. Um, Here's a group of moths that have evolved to look like hummingbirds, which is remarkable. And here's a moth that not only looks like a dead leaf, but a dead leaf with insect damage. So this thing can just walk around the forest floor and make its living and be really unnoticed by any potential predators. All right, there are other ways that things like moths have developed to evade predation. So we saw the coloration of the peppered moth as one way to do this. These are underwing moths. And so moths largely are nocturnal creatures, and they spend the daytime sitting on the trunks of trees. And as you can see, the coloration is very drab, so they kind of fit in nicely with the pattern of bark on the tree. But birds in particular, they actually, as they get more experienced as being a predator, they can they can kind of pick out that triangular shape that the moth is in its resting state. So with selection pressure, um, for coloration on the back wings, what has happened is that when the moth senses that it's about to be eaten by something like a bird, it'll flip open its front wings, reveal this striking bright pattern on the hind wings, and this creates it's what we call a startle effect. And it can be just bright coloration by itself, or even become more sophisticated, looking like eye spots, where the bird, for a second thinks it's looking at another predator. And so it gives the moth just enough time to evade predation. Mayflies. These are really cool insects. This is a mayfly nymph, and this is how it spends most of its life cycle. They're on this stream bed or the lake bed, and they basically move around on rocks and feed on algae, and that stage might take 1 or 2 years to develop, but when they're done, they emerge as an adult mayfly, this very elegant creature here. And mayflies are only out for 24, 48 hours, just long enough to mate, lay their eggs, and then they pass on. So these nymphs, they are really attractive as food for predators like fish. And so in order for the mayfly to develop into the adult stage and fly off, it has to navigate vertically up through that water column. And that makes it pretty, now it's off the rocks along the bottom of the pond or lake. And as it moves up through the water column, yeah, that's pretty easy pickings. So a defensive strategy that's evolved for the mayflies is, if you're going to emerge as adult mayflies, let's all synchronize our development and move up through that water column together. They can't get all of us. So it's a mass escape kind of strategy. And here's a mayfly hatch. And if you've ever had the experience to see a mayfly hatch on a stream or a pond, it's remarkable. I mean, it starts, you see them, mayflies or stoneflies everywhere, and it's over and done in about 15 minutes. Well, here's a mayfly hatch. This is the upper Mississippi River between Wisconsin and Minnesota. And here is a mayfly hatch, and it is so large that it was shown up as a Doppler radar signature. I mean, that is cajillions of mayflies all at once. And this is also interesting from an environmental standpoint because mayflies basically are pollution intolerant. So this basically reflects that the upper section of the Mississippi River is quite pristine. All right, lacewings. This is a really cool group of insects. They are a major predator, so they're very important in our gardens and agricultural ecosystems overall. So very delicate looking insect, but they're not the ones that are the beneficial predator. When they lay their eggs, they hatch out into these little larvae, and yeah, they look like little crocodiles. And these things are fearless. Any type of insect they bump into, yeah, they're going to gobble it down, and that includes each other. So there is potential for a high degree of cannibalism, which is actually not good for overall for the population. Well, through natural selection, what has happened is these green lacewing adults, they lay their eggs on these thin stalked filaments, and these eggs don't hatch out synchronously. And so as these individual eggs hatch out into larvae, the larvae climb down that thread, and it's just enough time to scoot away and find things like aphids and scale insects and really avoid bumping into its own kind. Vampire moths. Moths largely have these um, soft coiled mouth parts for feeding on flowers and other parts of plants. And there's um, moths in Southeast Asia that don't feed on plant parts, but they feed on the secretions around the eyes of cattle and other animals. Well, over time, that soft, spongy mouth part has evolved to a point where it's now a stiffer and stiffer bristle, where instead of now lapping up mucus secretions around the edge of the eye, it's stiff enough now where it can abrade the skin. And actually, these guys do take and consume blood as part of their lifestyle. Molting. In order for insects or arthropods in general to grow, they have to be able to go from one stage, small, and they're in like a suit of armor, basically. And in order to grow, it has to shed that skin in order to continue and grow and become an adult. And this is a complex chemical process. And there are two hormones that are really important here. There's a juvenile hormone, and that basically keeps the insect as like a larva or caterpillar in its juvenile state. And as the hormone fluctuates and it's tighter, it signals that, okay, it's time to grow to the next level, okay, a little bit larger. And that's where ecdysone comes into play. So with the combination of juvenile hormone going up and down, and when it signals that it's okay, it's time to become the next largest stage, um, as shown here, it's splitting out of its shell. That's where this ecdysone, the molting hormone, comes into play. Now, these two hormones, they are very complex, large molecules. Hard to think about something that through natural selection, that those chemicals would be constructed or synthesized by anything but the insects themselves. Well, lo and behold, in the plant world, they have learned to defend themselves quite marvelously. Bracken ferns, you may not notice, but if now you do take a look at bracken ferns, you'll rarely see insect feeding damage. And that's because bracken ferns can actually synthesize that molting hormone, ecdysone. So if insects feed on the bracken fern, it'll trigger them to molt over and over and over, and that requires a lot of energy, and so the insect eventually dies. And so ecdysone, or chemicals like ecdysone, are now being used as biologically beneficial insecticides in agriculture. Same with things like this Douglas fir. Douglas fir produces something that looks very much like juvenile hormones. So as insects feed on things like Douglas fir and related trees, those insects never mature into the adult stage that would be able to lay eggs and grow the populations. So in the plant world, we see some remarkable natural selection towards the synthesis of unique biochemicals unique to insects. Bees. Um, Bees are extraordinary as social insects, and bees they communicate a lot through the use of chemicals called pheromones. So here's a queen bee, and she's here. She's the one in the middle with that red dot on her back. And what she's doing is distributing a queen bee mandibular pheromone to her daughters, the worker bees that are around her. And a hive might contain 30 or 40,000 worker bees. And so this mandibular pheromone is communicating a couple things to the worker bees. One, it's telling them that mom's home, mom's healthy, and mom's laying eggs to the tune of 1,000 eggs a day. And so they distribute this among all the other workers throughout the hive. And this is basically kind of a glue for the hive. So it's something that's evolved to a point where as social caste structure goes, it's really an important component of how the bees communicate and keep the hive going smoothly. Well, this queen bee mandibular pheromone has actually been synthesized and for supporting research, but it's also been able to be put into controlled release devices. And these devices are available and they're used at a very popular event at many county fairs, the Bee Beard Contest. Yeah, you strap one of those dispensers to your chin or another part of your body, and the idea is who can come up with the best looking bee beard. Now, I will tell you that this is not as dangerous as it looks. In fact, this is a rigged game. Just before they release those worker bees, they let them drink as much sugar water as they can ingest, and this has the effect of like having a big Thanksgiving dinner. After that dinner, you're not aggressive. You just want to sit down on the couch and watch the game and digest. Well, the same thing with these bees. They're in such a state of overfed that they're not aggressive at all. And when it's done, they'll just scrape those bees down to a bucket and put them back into the colony. Well, here's a person that put the bee beard contest on a very high level. This guy, this took about an hour to do. He constructed a bee suit. And this person, he is standing on a scale, and that bee suit weighed 57 pounds. And if you do the arithmetic, that bee suit which consisted of over 250,000 bees. So think about this for your next outdoor barbecue with the family. Bees produce a number of other pheromones too, as insect societies evolved in ways to communicate. Um, Bees die after about 4 weeks. That's their lifespan, and they may die in the field, but they also may die in the hive. And so bees, when they die, they emit a funeral pheromone. And so if a bee dies within the hive, that tells her sisters that okay, Gladys has gone to meet her maker. It's time to get Gladys out of the hive. They take her out to the front door, boot her out, and then she's easy prey for scavengers like yellow jackets. Bees change their jobs as they get older. So when an adult bee hatches out, she cleans the hive. That's her job. Uh, she's looking around the hive. It's a big mess. She didn't make the mess, but it's an unfair job, but it's to clean. They get a little bit older, they become nurse bees. A little bit older, they start building comb, capping brood, and just become before they become foraging bees, they are guard bees. They're stationed at the entrance to the hives, and because things like yellow jackets and hornets, they'll come in and test the strength of the hive, and if they sense the hive is weak, maybe due to disease or something, they'll recruit their sisters, come in and rob the hive of all the honey and all the brood and bring it back to their hive to feed their kids. So the guard bees, if they sense that something like a yellow jacket is too close for their own good, they will attack it. And once they start attacking as a guard bee, they release this alarm pheromone. And this has the effect that other guard bees in the area are now automatically recruited to come join the fight. So it's kind of like a gang tackling in football. Very, very effective. Well, this alarm pheromone has been synthesized and is being used in a very unique application. It's being used over in Africa on farms as a repellent. Well, what the heck could this alarm pheromone really be repelling? Well, this alarm pheromone repels elephants. Yeah, elephants have very thin skin around their eyes, and they don't like bee stings at all. So they get a whiff of that alarm pheromone, and they are out of there. So as these pheromones have evolved, they've had they're multi-purposed. Fireflies. Everybody likes fireflies. This is an insect that emits a cold form of light, and so this is a communication system. This is used for because if we look at these, all species of fireflies basically look alike. They to the naked eye, there's really no big differences. So how do the different species tell themselves apart? Well, they use these cold light flashes. Um, it's kind of like Morse code. So if we look at this top line here, we see a flash and then a pause, a flash, a pause, a flash, and a pause. If you look at the second one down, it's a quick flash and a longer pause, a quick flash, a longer pause. Look at the middle one, three flashes in a row followed by a pause, and so on and so forth. So this is how the game works. So basically, if you were to do time-lapse photography in like a forest, this is the picture you would see. Well, the way this works is that the male fireflies, are the ones flying and emitting their flash pattern. The females are down on the ground floor, and when they see the flash pattern of their species, they emit their flash pattern. They send that signal upstairs. The male sees it, drops down to the ground, and mates with the female. Well, there is a variation on this that's really, really cool. La femme fatale, okay? In this case, the male firefly is buzzing around emitting his species specific flash pattern. This femme fatale firefly, she's down there on the ground, and when she identifies the flash pattern of a different species, she will copy that flash pattern. She'll send that false signal upstairs. The male drops down to the ground thinking that it's going to be an opportunity for mating, and she eats him. So it's a interesting twist on how communications can backfire on different species. So with that, um, I've really enjoyed spending time with you on what I hope you find to be very interesting, intriguing, and in some cases, mind-boggling. And I look forward to the first opportunity to get back with you in person.
Thank you so much for your time, Larry.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
You did a great job and it was very interesting. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you much.
All right, you take care. Thanks for joining, everybody.